If you think life gets easier when you're rich, you're wrong. Howard Hughes is proof that even a talented genius isn't smart enough to handle billions of dollars. So what makes you think you'd do any better? What exactly have you achieved compared to Howard Hughes? He was a pilot, tycoon, filmmaker, socialite, philanthropist, aerospace engineer, and the worst businessman of the 20th century. A fascinating man who did so much in life it's hard to fit his history into this one video. Hughes' life is fraught with so much truth, myth, success, and failure that he put the crazy in Crazy Rich. Heck, he put the eccentric in Eccentric Billionaire. When you think of Musk, Bezos, and Mr. Burns, you'll think of their lavish spending, peculiar personalities, and their rich guy laugh. But it was Howard Hughes who set the trend, and it's his downfall that sets him apart from all other prodigies. We're talking about a wasted inheritance, wasted legacy, wasted opportunity, wasted fortune, and wasted potential. At his height, he was a darling of Hollywood and the US government's go-to defense contractor during World War II. If you've ever wondered who inspired Tony Stark, or Tony Stark's father, Howard Stark, well, you're about to find out. Yet despite his public standing, Hughes died a shabby, paranoid recluse, swamped in legal battles and fighting the demons of his delusions. But how much of his downfall was his own design? What if his larger-than-life reputation exceeds his true life? Take the story of the Desert Inn Hotel in Las Vegas. According to legend, Hughes couldn't sleep because the bright lights of the hotel across the street were keeping him awake. Apparently, he phoned up the hotel to demand they dim their sign. They refused, so Hughes bought the hotel. Sounds like the type of thing a kooky billionaire would do, but this time the truth is stranger than fiction. In reality, Hughes was staying at the Desert Inn, but when it came time to check out, he just stayed where he was. Negotiating with him was so hard that even union leader / mobster Jimmy Hoffa couldn't get the rich oddball to budge, even though Jimmy Hoffa was on Hughes' side. So in the end, it was simply easier to sell the hotel to him. So how did this stubborn guest learn that he could buy his way through life? And did he ever realise it was only a matter of time until he got his comeuppance? To answer that, we need to examine the beginnings of Howard Hughes Jr. But even that is a challenge. Some sources say he was born in a small town near Houston called Humble. If true, it would mean the universe really does have a sense of humour after all. Next, his birth date is contested. Most sources, like his draft card, say it's Christmas Eve 1905, but other records, like his baptism certificate, list him as being born a few months earlier on September 24th. If that doesn't prove he was destined to be a man of mystery, consider his upbringing. As an only child, he was primed to be spoiled. His father, Howard Hughes Sr., had made a fortune by inventing an innovative drill for oil. Not only did it revolutionize the industry, the wealth and prestige set a high level of expectation for his namesake to achieve. Then there's young Hughes' mother, Aline Stone Garno. She was a socialite whose family tree had roots in the ministry and government. From her, he inherited a sense of standing, privilege, and responsibility. But he also inherited her mental health. Though not much is known about her private life, it appears she had phobias of germs and small creatures, and checked him every day to be sure he wasn't sick. Some say this led to her being overprotective of her only son, which would have taught him to be cautious. Yet young Hughes seemed to follow in the footsteps of his risk-taking father. At school, he excelled in mathematics and science. By age 11, he'd built Houston's first wireless radio transmitter. Clearly, he was a prodigy. By 14, he'd motorized his bicycle using parts of his father's steam engine. That same year, he took his first flying lesson, an obsession which would lead him to study aeronautical engineering at Caltech. Remember, studying aeronautics at this time would have been like getting into computer science during the 50s. That's how far ahead Hughes was able to see where things were heading. That's probably why he rubbed people the wrong way. Some school reports have him down as a bright but shy student who preferred to keep himself to himself. Others pegged him as a spoilt brat who thought he was better than everyone else. Whether this was jealousy or the growing pains of adolescence wouldn't matter because Hughes wouldn't have much time to enjoy his childhood. When he was just 18 years old, Hughes was orphaned. First, his mother passed from complications from an ectopic pregnancy. A cynic would say this would have made his start as an only child feel all the more destined and important. But a realist would say this tragedy likely was the catalyst for Hughes' future fears of the body and illness, especially when Hughes' father died suddenly from a heart attack during a business meeting 2 years later. He'd had hardly any time to process his grief when the young man, still technically a minor, inherited 75% of his father's business. It was around $500,000, possibly $1 million, which in 2024 would have been between 9 to 18 million. And with his father leasing his drills rather than selling them, Hughes was set up to receive a steady income of cash for the rest of his life. What would you have done with that sort of cash when you were a foolish 18-year-old? It's time to learn how history works as we unravel the life story of Howard Hughes. This week's video is sponsored by Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one business operations software with powerful tools for SMEs, including CRM, marketing, inventory, and more. I've been using Odoo's website builder for an exciting new project, creating a history-focused site to share some of the most fascinating stories from the past. I was amazed at how straightforward it was to get started. The tool is perfect for anyone. No coding needed. With just a few clicks, I was able to drag and drop content and customize the look and feel. Plus, Odoo includes unlimited hosting, support, and even a free custom domain for 1 year. The built-in ChatGPT integration helped me craft engaging articles quickly and fine-tune them for different tones and styles, making the whole process enjoyable and efficient. If you're thinking of building your own site, whether for personal or business use, Odoo's website builder is definitely worth trying out. Start creating for free at odoo.com/r/YIH. Trust me, you'll find it's never been easier to share your passions online. Young Howard was the sole heir to a successful and lucrative business. He had two choices: run the company in an industry he knew nothing about, or sell his shares to fund a millionaire playboy lifestyle. He did both. First, he bought out the remaining shares from his family members. Easier said than done. He had to leverage personal assets as well as nearly deplete company funds to purchase stock. But once the entire company was under his control, he put an executive in charge and made sure to never set foot in the headquarters ever again. Some might say this move was genius. He'd found a way to automate a business, whilst still retaining influence without needing to work. To others, it was just a way to siphon off cash to fund his lifestyle and ego. By 19, he'd left college, married a sweet gal, and played a lot of golf. In effect, he lived like he was retired. And he played so much golf that he could have gone pro. But Hughes wanted more beyond his passion for flying and his impressive golf swing. He found a new passion: filmmaking. His uncle was already an established filmmaker, and Hughes certainly had the funds to jumpstart his career, but it seems he had eyes for other things. His sexual appetite led him to pursue starlets, which eroded his marriage. But he didn't let personal problems get in the way of a good time. He took more flying lessons and produced Hollywood films on the side. Usually, a Hollywood producer doesn't learn on the job, or with his own cash, but Howard's penchant for middle management meant his productions were tumultuous, to say the least. The first film he financed was a short film, which he may or may not have directed too, but either way, we can't know because Hughes hated it so much that he had the original footage destroyed. Yet, it didn't take long until he achieved success. In 1927, he produced Two Arabian Nights, a financial success which helped Hughes' director, Louis Milestone, win one of the first Academy Awards, which we now call the Oscar for Best Director of a Comedy, at the first ever Academy Awards ceremony in 1929. Now that really is a milestone. But such successes only fueled his ego and obsessive tendencies. The next few years had him producing his most well-known film, Hell's Angels. His directorial debut cost about $4 million at the time, which would be around $75 million in today's cash. At the time, it was one of the most expensive movies ever made. That might not seem like much for a Hollywood production today, but remember, the checks weren't being signed by a studio. All the money for pilots and directors came from Hughes. And remember, 3 people died as the result of creating Hell's Angels. In the end, the film only earned around a third of its budget. By now, Hughes had become so careless with money that he was trading stocks in his bed. He must have felt untouchable in the lead up to the Great Depression, but he was poised to lose $8 million, which in 2024 is almost $150 million. To be clear, this was all prior to the Great Depression. But despite a rough start to the 1930s, the decade wasn't a complete bust for Howard. While he'd lost $4 million on Chrysler stock at the start of the decade, by the end of the decade he was working his way to purchasing the majority of what would become Trans World Airlines. Jumping ahead, Trans World Airlines would eventually force him out, and he sold his stake in the company in 1966, netting him $500 million. Adjusting for 2024 inflation, that's just shy of $5 billion. Looking back, it was clear that aviation was always his calling. With money trickling in from his inherited company, he set up Hughes Aircraft Company in 1932 to be a defense contractor. But really, it was a cover for his own vanity project. One of the first planes to come off the assembly line was his H-1 Racer in 1935. Despite being made from wood and metal, this sleek, streamlined design helped Hughes break the land plane speed record with an impressive speed of 352 miles per hour. 2 years later, he set the record for transcontinental speed by flying his personal project non-stop from LA to New York. It took him just 7.5 hours. A year later, he would set a new record of 91 hours for fastest flight around the world. His feats got everyone talking. Ticker tape parades were held for the shy magnate, but also the US military sought out his expertise. With World War II underway, his company was contracted to invent a flying boat to circumvent the Nazi U-boat presence in the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, Hughes failed to deliver. The only craft it successfully produced was a prototype of the Hercules, aka the Spruce Goose. This Herculean giant held the record for the largest wingspan of any aircraft at 97.5 meters, about 319 feet. The massive wooden plane cost about $20 million, took 5 years to make, yet it wasn't ready until after the war. Only one flight ever happened, a trajectory of barely a mile, 70 feet above water. After that, it sat in an air-conditioned hangar to the tune of $1 million a year, as per Howard Hughes' explicit instructions. Such flagrant misbehaviour didn't go unnoticed. In 1947, Hughes was subpoenaed to testify before the US Senate War Investigating Committee to determine whether his handling of American tax dollars was irresponsible. Yet Hughes's impassioned defense magnetized viewers and radio audience, and further cemented his positive reputation in the public eye, especially when it came to light that he'd personally test-piloted another ill-fated plane, the XF-11, for which Hughes paid a heavy physical toll: a crushed lung, burns, and a fractured skull. His long, painful recovery had required medication. It seems obvious now how his addiction to painkillers would exacerbate his obsessive-compulsive disorder, and his testimony before the committee clearly revealed his paranoid tendencies. He portrayed himself as a patriot, hounded by no-gooders, and the victim of political persecution. It also became increasingly obvious that Hughes's meddling was what set back his aviation company. A few years after the investigation, and with much of the upper management quitting over difficulties working with Hughes, Hughes formed a new executive team and, as he did 30 years prior with his father's company, promptly removed himself. Surprise, surprise, the company started doing well. Decades later, the company would produce things like the Galileo spacecraft and the AIM-4 Falcon, the world's first air-to-air guided missile. That said, the designs of the H-1 Racer influenced military aviation years after Hughes's speed record. In any case, Hughes had been growing restless once again. He had already decided to give Hollywood another shot. And like always, this new chapter would see him pull off impressive feats at the cost of a trail of destruction. In 1948, Hughes purchased a controlling interest in RKO Pictures. RKO was one of the Big Five studios who helped run Hollywood's golden era. But if you're not sure if you've heard of them, you can probably guess why. Under Hughes's leadership, the legendary movie studio slowly imploded. As a testament to Hughes's erratic leadership style, he sold his shares in 1953, only to buy back the entire company in 1954. During his reign, RKO lost $22 million. Employee numbers plummeted from around 2,000 to fewer than 500. He even failed to copyright his own movie The Outlaw, the very movie where he was obsessed with Jane Russell's dress line. So if you want to check it out, you're in luck. The movie is in the public domain. However, his obsession with actresses was the same off-screen. Although he'd cultivated an image as a charming playboy, his paranoid tendencies made life a living hell for any woman who caught his eye. He'd hire private investigators to monitor their every move. He'd mess with their schedules so that the subjects of his infatuations never met. And as you can guess, he'd hold their careers hostage if he didn't get what he wanted. Take Ava Gardner. She said she had to physically defend herself against Hughes during an argument. "I hit him with a marble ashtray," she said in her autobiography. "I'm sure I broke his jaw. He just stood there and bled." She also added, "I don't think he ever loved anything in his life except his airplanes, and he never seemed able to stay away from power. It was like a drug to him." Ginger Rogers also said he was controlling. "He wanted me to be available at his beck and call." In her memoir titled My Life with Howard Hughes, Faith Domergue said, "He was all-consuming. He wanted me to belong to him." Yet other love interests say the opposite. Katharine Hepburn nursed him after his near-fatal plane crash and dated him for 4 years. She said their split was amicable. That would explain why they stayed friends afterwards. Terry Moore admitted he had problems, quote, "but had a heart of gold." And what about his wife Jean Peters? She was with him for almost 15 years. Perhaps this he said, she said is just another example of the inevitable mystique of a larger-than-life billionaire. Or perhaps his rocky relationships were a precursor for the final chapter of his life. The 1950s was the beginning of the end for Howard Hughes. His behaviour had become even more erratic. He locked himself away and refused to cut his hair or trim his nails. One rumour is that his obsessions with germs had led him to wearing Kleenex boxes as shoes. When employees did see him, they had to avert their eyes and communicate through written notes, as per his instructions. His career had been filled with disagreements and difficulties taking criticisms, but now he was flying off the handle over the smallest of things. And this was all while he holed himself up in an LA screening room for months. He sat there, naked, dictating notes into a recorder while watching movies over and over again, eating nothing but chocolate bars and milk. No prizes for guessing that he was losing it. Some even say his marriage to Jean Peters was simply a technicality so that he couldn't be committed to an asylum. Then again, he'd been living in an asylum of his own design for some time. When he suddenly emerged from the dark Los Angeles screening room, he immediately set up camp in a Beverly Hills suite. Howard continued his reclusive behaviour and conducted business by phone. However, his health took a turn for the worse when he started injecting himself with morphine to alleviate his pains. Meals were sent to him to avoid public appearances, and he even rented bungalows in addition to his penthouse to guarantee him layers of privacy. Yet his exploits only got him more attention. The 1960s marked his Las Vegas takeover. By the time he was done, he'd have transformed Las Vegas irrevocably. Previously, casinos were seen as controlled by the mob, but his spending spree attracted corporate interest. It started with the Desert Inn, where he famously bought it instead of checking out. From there, he purchased more hotels, casinos, and undeveloped land. What really got people's attention was buying a television station for his personal use. The story goes he was tired of stations switching off at night, so bought one out to run 24 hours a day, effectively creating round-the-clock broadcasting. According to some Las Vegas residents, it wasn't uncommon to be watching one program only for it to suddenly turn over to an old movie because Hughes had picked up the phone to demand they change the programming. Even if people couldn't see Howard Hughes, they could see his presence. Another urban legend has it that when he was staying at a hotel in Canada, photographers camped outside his hotel room desperate for a snap. One journalist hang-glided past his window in hope of capturing photographic evidence of a Kleenex-wearing billionaire. On top of that, tabloid articles about him were always doing the rounds. There were the Mormons who faked a will saying they stood to inherit his fortune, though they claim the unwitnessed last will and testament arrived by mail. Then there was the guy who faked writing Howard's autobiography and tried to sue him. The hoax was such a scandal that the billionaire had to come out of hiding to denounce the hoax over a telephone call. The only way for Hughes to get away from the spotlight was to, well, get away. London was to be his final hideaway. Though he was holed up like before, he did leave his hotel on one occasion, to fly a plane around Britain's capital whilst in the nude. Shortly thereafter, he fell in his hotel room. His injury was so bad that he'd lost the ability to walk. Without a doubt, he'd lost the mental and physical capacity to run, well, anything. By now, his portfolio of businesses had either been folded into themselves, handed over to new buyers, or collapsed. Even though he had strong finances, it paled in significance to the losses and wastage he had accumulated. It's fair to say it was over. In 1972, Hughes had a heart attack, which compounded his health problems. Then on April 5th, 1976, he was flying to a hospital when he succumbed to kidney failure. Howard Hughes was 70 years old. Despite hiding himself away for so long, the news and photos of his death renewed public interest. When people saw the damage he had done to his frail, emaciated body, the truth couldn't be hidden any longer. The question that remains is how much of his downfall was his doing. There's no doubt medical science was not advanced enough to help his mental health problems. Perhaps if he'd had stronger support, he'd have been better at managing his difficulties. Then again, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, a spoilt only child who didn't like being told no, and could get away with it because he did show signs of genius. But that's the thing, genius and insanity are two sides of the same coin. So it makes sense that for a man like Howard Hughes, happy endings were always going to be 50-50. If you liked this video, check out our one on William Durant to see another genius lose everything because he was ahead of his time. And subscribe to keep learning how history works.